Yes, so as I outlined in the short abstract for the talk, I'd like us to think around the notion of technologies of enclosure tonight, to reflect on the phenomenon of fences, material fences that are being erected in many places around the world. So we can start by mentioning geopolitical ones. Here we see the existing fence along the highway from Calais to the border and port that leads to the UK. And in the post-Brexit UK, there is a large project to build the Great Wall of Calais and to further reinforce this existing highway border. We can also mention the kind of previously existing ones around the external borders of Europe, of the European Union. Here we can see what has been actually reinforced during the so-called EU migrant crisis as a double fence and concertina wire running along the border between Macedonia and Greece. Of course, we all think of Donald Trump's announcement of a new wall along the US-Mexico border. By the way, it actually already exists. This is the wall that runs to almost a third of the 3,000 kilometers of border between the US and Mexico. Or we can think of the separation barrier running through the occupied Palestinian territories. And in particular, as pictured here, the one that has been shutting off the Gaza Strip from the rest of the world for over a decade now. This is the separation barrier close to the Erez crossing at the north of the Gaza Strip, with a unmanned watchtower and a remote-controlled machine gun on top of it. But we can also discuss other forms of fences, perhaps more inconspicuous, less immediately spectacular, such as the urban ones. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of this phenomenon of gated communities, which is kind of driving urban forms of urbanism globally, as well as the fencing of urban sites that are considered no longer apt to be presented in the city, that are earmarked for urban regeneration, for example, as we can see in this example here, with an actual the fence being a point of conflict between local activists, community housing activists in London, trying to tear down the fence that is shutting the access to the Aylesbury estate, which is a very large council estate, now set to be demolished and redeveloped in South London. And we'll see another example today around these questions. So somehow it looks like the fence, this very rudimentary architectural device, as old as history itself, in fact, count among the most important and most widely used technologies in the contemporary ordering of human spaces and territories. And this somehow goes a bit against the dominant ideology of globalization, right? We have the fall of the Berlin Wall that promised to usher the whole world in a new era of unified communication and exchange. And from that symbolic historical moment, a discourse that gained momentum around the dissolution of borders and boundaries, replaced by the free flow of people in capital around the world. The disintegration of distance, allegedly so, the overcoming of its tyranny that used to set us apart, made possible by new means of transport and electronic communication that would, so goes the discourse, bring us all ever so close in the blink of an eye. But that just has never been the case. Except for a tiny minority belonging to a new global privileged class who is granted smooth access pretty much everywhere. As the post-colonial thinker Homi Bhabha stated as early as 1992, the globe shrinks for those who own it, for the displaced or the dispossessed, the migrant or the refugee. No distance is more awesome than the few feet across borders or frontiers. But precisely in order to filter and sift through flows of people and goods, in order to distinguish between those that should be granted safe passage and those that should be denied, what we see is actually a multiplication of borders everywhere around the world. So the first point to which we will return is that rather than disappearing with the increasing and accelerating flows of globalization, borders are proliferating. And in this perspective, rather than thinking the border as that which stops movement, I think it should be approached as the very devices that enable or foster the particular kind of differential movement that defines our globalized condition. How so? Let's delve a little deeper into this. So the premise of the talk today is to think of camps and gulags not only as historical products, as ultimate expressions of the unique, horrific violence that marked the middle of the 20th century and modern history more largely, as historical products that would have been overcome right now. So not only thinking them in those terms, but instead thinking them as radical, extreme, paradigmatic examples of an architectural typology of enclosure, which continues to a large extent to order spaces and territories, to produce the spaces in which we live today. Adopting this architectural perspective, we will try to track the technical means and the overall logic of enclosing spaces, of separating, isolating, and differentiating territorial plots in a number of very different contemporary contexts. The hypothesis here is this: we still have a lot to learn from camps and gulags. It is essential to grasp their spatial legacy if we are to effectively resist and oppose the violence at work in the spaces of the present, in the contemporary global urban order. A quick but I think important point. Here, by no means I intend to equate the violence that characterizes the Nazi camp on the one end or the Soviet gulag on the other with that which we will unpack in contemporary conditions. Nor do I wish to deny the historical specificity of each system of camps and the importance to approach them as such. The point here would be, in fact, it isn't a particularly new one. I'm elaborating on the thoughts of many theorists here. The point would be to complement such situated historical analysis of camps and gulags with an architectural perspective that may reveal some elements of continuity with present spatial conditions. And we can also discuss to what degree it's really relevant, to what degree the connection makes sense and enables thought and action in the present. Perhaps sometimes it is too stretched. It's really about testing an hypothesis, and given the kind of relatively short and small committee here, I would really appreciate your feedback and if we can kind of engage in a discussion around this after. So before jumping into specific projects, an important and well-known reference to mention here is Giorgio Agamben, who famously proposed the camp as the nomos of the modern, suggesting that we regard the camp as, quoting, the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we are still living. We could, I don't know, nomos we could translate by law or perhaps ordering principle, local. So I guess the talk today is about probing the validity of this proposal and also perhaps approach it critically and possibly go beyond. Okay, so the projects that I will show were developed in a way that it was disconnected to the specific theme, so I'm just kind of pulling from my archive of research projects and trying to reorganize it around this specific question, if you want. And so I'm not going to speak about the entirety of the project, but just the elements that are relevant to our main focus. And I will try to use them as ways to approach one specific notion for each project, right? So in this case, the notion of landscape. So it's a project here that I did quite a few years ago when I was doing my master in London in 2010. When I arrived, in fact, in London, I became quickly fascinated with this place right here, which is a council estate called the Haygate, that, by the way, no longer exists. It's a massive residential complex of more than 1,200 flats, which was located in central London, Elephant and Castle for those who know it, but completely desert. By the way, these beautiful kind of Tarkovsky-looking photographs, they're not mine, but from a photographer called Simon Kennedy, which I think deserves some credit here. So it was once home to more than 3,000 people. And when I discovered it, it was almost completely deserted. Only 6 out of 1,260 flats weren't evacuated and sealed off. So still a few residents here and there. Equate the violence that characterizes the Nazi camp on the one end or the Soviet Gulag on the other with that which we will unpack in contemporary conditions. Nor do I wish to deny the historical specificity of each system of camps and the importance to approach them as such. The point here would be, in fact, it isn't a particularly new one. I'm elaborating on the thoughts of many theories here. The point would be to complement such situated historical analysis of camps and gulags with an architectural perspective that may reveal some elements of continuity with present spatial conditions. And we can also discuss to what degree it's really relevant, to what degree the connection makes sense and enables thought and action in the present. Perhaps sometimes it is too stretch. It's really about testing an hypothesis, and given the kind of relatively short and small committee here, I would really appreciate your feedback and if we can kind of engage in discussion on this after. So before jumping into specific projects, an important and well-known reference to mention here is George Agamben, who famously proposed the camp as the nomos of the modern, suggesting that we regard the camp as, quoting, the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we are still living. We could, I don't know, nomos we could translate by law, perhaps ordering principle, your call. So I guess the talk today is about probing the validity of this proposal and also perhaps approach it critically and possibly go beyond. Okay, so the projects that I will show were developed in a way that it was disconnected to the specific theme, so I'm just kind of pulling from my archive of research projects and trying to reorganize it around this specific question, if you want. And so I'm not going to speak about the entirety of the project, but just the elements that are relevant to our main focus. And I will try to use them as ways to approach one specific notion for each project, right? So in this case, the notion of landscape. So it's a project here that I did quite a few years ago when I was doing my master in London in 2010. When I arrived, in fact, in London, I became quickly fascinated with this place right here, which is a council estate called the Haygate, that, by the way, no longer exists. It's a massive residential complex of more than 1,200 flats, which was located in central London, Elephant and Castle for those who know it, but completely desert. By the way, these beautiful kind of Tarkovsky-looking photographs, they're not mine, but from a photographer called Simon Kennedy, which I think deserves some credit here. So it was once home to more than 3,000 people. So when I discovered it, it was almost completely deserted. Only 6 out of 1,260 flats weren't evacuated and sealed off. So still a few residents here and there. The perimeter of the estate was encircled by miles of hoardings and fences. And it took some observation skills to actually spot a few tiny passages that had been left open around the estate to allow for the last few residents to actually pass and access their flats. So my interest started to be on the void itself, on this void produced or that appeared in the middle of this bustling city, and that was to last for 8 years, right? It kind of the process of what they call decantation of the residents of the estate started in 2007, and the actual demolition was scheduled for 2015, right? So a space of that size in the middle of London, one of prime property, marketplace, etc. How could it exist for such a long time? So that was kind of the research question I started with. What was going on in that void? What was at stake in its production and maintenance? And what was its relation to this teeming and bustling city surrounding it? So, doing this research, something quickly came up, which is that the Highgate had been turned into an image factory. Between 2007 and 2010, no less than 76 films, feature-length movies, short movies, documentaries, music videos, advertisements had been shot in the estate. And as you can see from the images, they kind of all revolve around a picturing of a kind of urban jungle and crime going on in this estate. So precisely, images of crime within the estate started to formulate a discourse in which the architecture of the estate itself was a crime. So to quote an element of the piece, made possible by the void, the abundant fictionalization of the Highgate rubbed off on its remembered past, and by feedback loop became the very motive of its evacuation in the first place. So, through this image-making process, images that had been circulated very widely, beyond also the kind of local London sphere, but nationally and internationally, we have the fixation of the Highgate into a landscape. A landscape not only physical, but also, mediated landscape, if you want. And to this, we can relate perhaps the efforts put by the council in hoarding and fencing off the place, which was not yet demolished and still inhabited. Because its destiny was already sealed, the Highgate was not to be approached, but only seen from the distance. Even in its material form, the Highgate was only to appear as a landscape. So again, reading a kind of short extract of the piece I wrote on the topic. The 12-story high, 180-meter long Claydon block, now completely vacant and sealed off, stands right in front of the Elephant and Castle rail station, parallel to the tracks. Between the two, a long hoarding encloses a construction site which, although unrelated to the Highgate's demolition, makes the whole estate look already fenced off. From the elevated platform of the station, one can enjoy a far-reaching view. In the background, the monumental corpse of the Claydon block. In the foreground, a bird's-eye view of the construction workers laying the foundations of the new Oak Main Plaza. And turning one's eye towards central London, the unending rise of the Shard over the horizon. Tens of thousands of commuters pass every day by this landscape, which Indeed, actually, I should have put the quote that I will read in a second before, but which indeed doesn't simply expose how things are, but asserts how things will inescapably be. Every gap is bridged or capped. The passage from concrete estates to glass towers is framed as a relation of continuity, a smooth transition, a natural and irresistible progress. There is no alternative. The past is already gone, the future is already there. Just watch it happen and strive to be part of it. Left to rot for years in such a public setting, the Haygate's corpse is assigned a clear role, to narrate its own defeat and to redirect our gaze towards a more glittering horizon. And so this passage was very inspired also by this argument by William Mitchell on landscape in a book called Landscape and Power, in which he says, the question is not what landscape is or means, but what it does, how it works as a cultural practice. Landscape, we suggest, doesn't merely signify or symbolize power relations. It is an instrument of cultural power, perhaps even an agent of power, that is or frequently represents itself as independent of human intentions. And he continues, landscape as a cultural medium thus has a double role with respect to something like ideology. It naturalizes a cultural and social construction, representing an artificial world as if it were simply given and inevitable, and it also makes that representation operational by interpolating its beholders in some more or less determinate relation to its givenness as sight and sight. Sight the view and sight the location. Alright, so I'll just mention it because it's part of the project, but then we go back to the kind of technologies of enclosure question. Recognizing this particular landscape as a political construct, my project included an intervention part, which is the unsolicited inscription of the words now and here on the roof of the Claydon block, which faced the train station. The idea was to disrupt that landscape, using its majorly visible situation to affirm the material presence of the place and of the void that it concealed, from which potentially an alternative future for that bit of the city or others could be imagined. Project of some time ago, perhaps my naive self still acting there. The place has since been demolished and a new massive luxury development is in its place, just so you know. But to go back to the discussion about landscape and technologies of enclosures, I think it's what we can take here is that it's important to go beyond a purely symbolic understanding of the landscape, and in particular of a landscape of fences. It goes beyond the symbolic register and beyond the spectacle of the border argument as well. I think, yes, so here I'm mentioning that it goes beyond the spectacle that would hide the actual waning sovereignty of former authorities such as nation states. The construction of a landscape of fence, some vividly displayed, but some also imperceptible, like the urban ones that we saw and that, kind of accompany our urban experience, also has a conditioning dimension beyond the spectacle. Landscape here kind of acts subliminally, affirming that there is no urban future other than one obsessed with security, because no one is safe and we should all fear each other, right? So I think that's where we can see a kind of operation of landscape more than a kind of representation or symbolic dimension of it. Okay. Another important notion for our discussion here that I would like to bring up is that of reversibility. And for this I use the example of a collective project elaborated with forensic architecture, which I believe Varvara introduced before, as well as the Yugoslav artist activist collective Grupa Spomenik. And this collective project was called Living Death Camps. I'm not going to take you through the whole thing, it was kind of a dense project, but of the two places that the project examined, we will only look at one here. which is Staro Sajmište, a place in Belgrade, which you can see here. Staro Sajmište, or which translates as the old fairground, was built in 1938 on the outskirts of Belgrade to host international exhibitions and to present the Kingdom of Yugoslavia as a modern, industrialized and technologically advanced nation. So it was a fairground. It had a kind of concentrical plan which was converging on the central tower, which was the kind of main attraction, if you want, with, if I remember well, the Serbian pavilion directly inside, and a range of pavilions around. And it had a fence that was, in this case, guarding against intrusions, if you want, so that the principle of a ticketed entrance for the fair could be implemented. But during World War II, and following the German invasion of Serbia in 1941, the fairground was transformed by the occupying Nazis into a death camp, where Jews, Roma, and political opponents were detained and killed. And in these archival photographs here, we see that the ticket booth that marked the entrance of the fairground later became the entry gate of the Semlin camp. In architectural terms, the logic of visibility that dictated the layout of the exhibition ground, with visual access converging on the central tower, also suited the panoptic regime of the camp. From the central tower, the entire camp could be visually surveyed. Excuse me. Consequently, no major structural transformation were necessary to turn the exhibition ground into a concentration camp. Even the high fence on its perimeter was conserved. After the war, the remaining structures of Sajmište, of the Sajmište complex, became the residence of several generations of people, particularly those from the most vulnerable sections of society, and included artist studios, workshops, and small industry, and homes for a Roma community. Due to the urban expansion of Belgrade over the past 60 years, Staro Sajmište is now at the center of the city. Recently, another transformation of the site was announced: its conversion into a Holocaust memorial and museum. But the plan, which was some sort of bargaining chip, let's say, a demand of the European Union and a condition for Serbia's entrance in or candidacy to the European Union, so required that this place be memorialized, that the Holocaust memorial and museum would be built there. But the plan threatened, and still threatens, to displace the local communities that had made Staro Sajmište their home and workplace since, and who, in living there, effectively protected the site from demolition and redevelopment. In fact, the first eviction of residents began in the summer of 2013. So, the important thing to note is, while there was a continuity without structural alteration between the fairground and the camp, the death camp, the only main structural change that happened after the war, when it started to be inhabited, was the removal of the fence. In light of the city of Belgrade's project to establish a Holocaust memorial in Staro Sajmište, which would necessitate the eviction of some or all the current residents, we attempted to highlight what we saw as an unacceptable contradiction. A Holocaust memorial cannot be built on a forcefully cleared ground without immediately compromising its purpose. And in order for such a claim to be articulated and heard, it needed a material basis. So that's where the idea of an archaeological report of this place started. A report of kind of a new sort, in which we used relatively new technologies such as 3D laser scans and ground penetrating radar, which is highlighted here. The zones that we scanned, the underground of which we scanned, are highlighted in blue. And the idea was to kind of generate, it's like a report that scans, this is the entire plan, and we have each section pavilion kind of broken down and analyzed for its different layers of historical uses, if you want. The idea was to produce also this kind of unified images that show the kind of deep entanglement of the different histories of the site, and it's the impossibility to kind of cancel one in order to reveal the other, etc. So the kind of the broad proposal was to, on the contrary, consider the living death camp itself as a memorial, and to kind of advocate for a plan of memorialization that would start from the acknowledgement of the fact that people are living there, and that would actually accommodate them in their in the project that would emerge. Okay. Again, like here, I'm going a little bit tangentially in relation to our main discussion, but the kind of main point being, again, the idea of avoiding that the fence be re-erected around this place, right? I mean, if it actually became a memorial, a kind of Holocaust museum, a memorial, as many as we know, security question would emerge, and again, very logically, a fence would be re-erected around that zone, which would kind of bring us back to the very same architectural typology, which we saw could, you know, reverse itself from a place that tries to guard from an exterior to one that actually encloses and imprisons an interior and the people contained inside, which to us continue to appear both architecturally and politically as a paradox. Someone called Benjamin Bratton has recently written about this question of reversibility of the camp enclave. As the utopia-dystopia of the Berlin Wall, known as the anti-fascist protection wall in East Germany, also made clear, the camp and the bunker, detention and the enclave are inversions of the same architectural form. One is an architecture of internalization and the other of externalization, but they share the same material profile. Each is built into the other and they share reversible design. And from this, I think, and in fact, he does, as others, we can draw a parallel between zones of exclusions, of outcast, death, labor camps, refugee camps, internment facilities for migrants, etc., and the kind of the inverted symmetry, if you want, which would be the kind of exclusive areas of the privilege of the world, gated communities, but at a larger scale, maybe special economic zones of the likes of Dubai and Shenzhen, right? The kind of places which are defined essentially through an enclosure that establishes a territorial differential and a kind of manages the access rights to it, right? And so we also see with the example that we just saw that over time and history, beyond the fact that they share the same material profile, both kind of poles of the spectrum, the same space can be at one point in history a camp or a bunker, a detention center and an enclave. And this points to the fence itself as the crucial material element in the spatial ordering at work here. The fence as a membrane which lets more or less flows in, right? And which has an orientation, importantly, from the inside out or the outside in. In which direction does it limit the flow? Is it guarding an interior or protecting against the interior? These are questions, I think, with which we can examine in meaningfully contemporary technologies of enclosure. The last notion that I would like to evoke is that of logistics. mainly the management of flows across spaces. And for this, I'd like to take the example of Gaza to discuss it. So here we have a big jump of scale in terms of the previous spaces that we've discussed. This is the Gaza Strip, 350 square kilometers, and today 2 million inhabitants. In fact, prisoners, as we will see. Interestingly, in spite of the scale of the satellite imagery, we can very clearly distinguish the border of this territory, right? Also because of the thick buffer zone that is redoubling and kind of expanding the actual linear fence separation barrier that separates Israel from Gaza. There is also a 300 to 500 meter deadly buffer zone, which is a no-go zone. You can get shot if you just come close to it. So we can very clearly see also different kind of territorial orders and management of the territory, right? I mean, a kind of messy urban sprawl on one hand, and on the other, kind of very clear and clean landscape of irrigated agriculture. So the Gaza barrier was first constructed from 1994 as part of the Oslo Accords, but was largely reinforced from 2005 onwards, from 2005-2007, when something major in the history of the Gaza Strip happened, which was the Israeli disengagement. So since '67, there were actual settlements, Israeli settlements and Israeli military forces in the Gaza Strip. But from 2005, there was a decision of a unilateral withdrawal, disengagement they called, from the Gaza Strip. So both civilian settlements and military forces were removed from the territory itself. And the barrier was largely reinforced and turned into a bordering apparatus with surveillance technology, drones, cameras, and all sorts of remote control engine, deadly ones as well, as we saw in the previous images. This started a new form of occupation, in fact, an occupation at distance, right? There is no more like a physical presence, but one that is at distance. And this was very kind of related to the subsequent takeover of election into power of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, from the moment of which Israeli authorities declared that Gaza was a hostile entity and imposed a complete blockade over the territory, right? So extremely tightly controlled movement of goods, people, facility, capital, everything across the border of Gaza. This is just a picture of the Erez crossing. So it's the only crossing at the north of the Gaza Strip, or whatever. Up north of the Gaza Strip, there's the only crossing for people, which is entirely operated by Israel. So the only way in or way out for humans, if you want, is through the Erez crossing, which we see here. Again, a sort of landscape of fences. Another one here. And this is an image of the other crossing, the one for goods, which is at the southern tip, Kerem Shalom. And we see a series of trucks carrying humanitarian, these are just mattresses, whatever, humanitarian goods, being delivered or about to enter Gaza under the scrutiny of an Israeli soldier. And I think this captures the kind of regime or mode of power that is at work there, which we will now unpack in greater detail. This is another image of the Kerem Shalom crossing, in which we see both kind of a logistical landscape and a landscape of security, and how they kind of are entangled here. So I think what we can draw from this is that places of enclosure, camps, gulags are not merely spaces of exclusion from social life, in some cases leading eventually to death, but they can, in their kind of the form that we're trying to develop here, or the understanding that we're trying to develop here, the kind of enlarged understanding, they can be spaces enabling to conduct a particular form of government. A government based on the total control of the inflows and outflows traversing a given space or territory. Government based on the modulation and channeling of such flows to produce particular effects. And I think this is nowhere more clear than in Gaza, with the current mode of occupation and subjugation of its population. You know, we often kind of think of Gaza only when it kind of pops out in the media through one of the many wars that it endured over the past 10 years. There was actually 3 wars since 2008, right? 2008, 2012, and 2014. Very deadly in terms of civilians, but it's also important to highlight the kind of structural violence of the enduring blockade, which is also suffocating and permanent and affecting permanently the whole of the population, which, as we mentioned, just reached 2 million inhabitants. So many writers, thinkers have written about a form of humanitarian violence at work in this mode of government. Eyaля and Eyaля Waitzman, among others. This complete fencing and control of the terminals of the crossings where goods can enter enables a mode of government based on, quoting Eyaля Waitzman, the calibration of life-sustaining flows of resources through the physical enclosure, one meant to keep the entire population close to the minimum limit of physical existence. It's running out of time, but we could mention kind of there was a redlining document that surfaced around 2009, which actually indicated a policy in the Israeli state to keep the number of calories that would enter Gaza to the minimum to a minimum based on the UN definition of hunger. So just calculating in relation to the number of people, the number of calories that should enter Gaza, 2,100 per person, per adult, per day, less for children. This is considered the absolute minimum under which the UN considers that the person is in a condition of hunger. And that kind of regime of calculation was translated into an actual form of logistics in which only those amount of calories would enter Gaza every day. So the idea of a pacification, of a making of docile bodies by through the kind of cutting of the supplies, right? As soon as something happens, be it calories, electricity, or fuel, the state of Israel can simply cut this inflow to Gaza, which is immediately creates a form of also collective punishment. Another example is that of the reconstruction of Gaza in the aftermath of the 2014 war. I've done some research on the subject myself, the blockade remained in force in the aftermath of the war, in which this one, the last one, 2014, Protective Edge, its, let's say, signature was really in terms of the amount of destruction to the urban environment that it brought about. Roughly a third of the houses, the entire housing stock of Gaza was destroyed or rendered inhabitable, right? So immediately after the war, the inability to even access basic construction materials such as cement or metal rebar to kind of build shelters or reconstruct the places that were destroyed, the impossibility to access it threatened to turn the whole place into a large humanitarian crisis. And so there was a UN brokered agreement called the Gaza Reconstruction Mechanism, which I'm not going to develop in detail here, but simply the principle is that it established a kind of trading of data for cement. So the UN would have laid down this time a kind of a digital infrastructure, a large database that would collect all the requests, all the individual applications for cement and construction materials of each single kind of individuals around Gaza. Centralize everything and treat each demand separately, right? So being able to modulate at a very, very high resolution the amount of materials and cement that would be dispatched around Gaza. So somehow here we see a kind of entanglement of the material infrastructure of separation and crossing, the kind of walls, the fences, with the digital one, which kind of come together in enabling a same logic or logistics of power, right? Of control and modulation of the flows that cross it. So we see here an example of a shift from the idea of a central authority, of government, of instituted or legally sanctioned sovereign. I mean, in Gaza it's not clear, right? Between Hamas, Israel, the UN, it's like there's no reference in terms of an instituted, legally sanctioned sovereign. So a shift from this as a source and holder of power to a structure of power which is essentially based first on the effective control of infrastructure of circulations, and secondly on the very material configuration and spatial disposition, to use the word of Keller Easterling, of this very infrastructure, which produces different effects according to how it is designed and technically implemented. And all these forms what we would call a logistics of power, which I would argue with many others is largely supplanting forms of sovereign power that have been ordering territories of the world since roughly the Westphalian peace treaties of 1648. But again, here we're a little bit going tangentially. Let us return to camps with logistics in mind. This is a quote by Paul Virilio in Speed and Politics. The precious lesson of the camps and the gulags has not been heeded because it was erroneously presented not only as an ideological phenomenon, but also as a static one, an enclosure. Its absolute inhumanity was the social bestiary of the immense biomass proletariat subsumed under logistical demands. Virilio here insists on the system of camps, beyond the kind of singular camp, right? Insists again on this idea of logistics, of the movement from and to the camp, the deportation to camps, between camps, the organization of a circulation of bodies managed and distanced, if you want. And through this logistical lens, we can also see that camps as a network, as a system, work essentially as devices of separation from the broader corpus of society and its territories. And once thought together in relation to each other, we see that circulation across fences, here again, is where we can locate the operations of power and track its continuities in the present. So, maybe just to conclude here with the suggestion of a certain reading of the large projects of enclosure technologies that we've also mentioned at the introduction, such as the Trump's Wall or the Great Wall of Calais. The idea would be to kind of mitigate, how do you say, well, there is a certain reading of this that sees it as again as a kind of spectacle of the borders, and we saw that it is not satisfying in itself. I wonder if the notion of the landscape that we've tried to develop before and its operation, a landscape of fences which serves also ideology here is sufficient. Perhaps it is not. Perhaps it is less about kind of these fences advocating or articulating and diffusing a kind of discourse of isolationist politics, withdrawal, right, into a nation state. Perhaps these projects are also very kind of concrete and material, and they can be read under a kind of a logistical lens again. We can see them as an upgrade of the technical and material means of the existing bordering apparatus's capacity to filter at an ever-increasing resolution what can go through them. This is perhaps why we see that actually the Trump wall exists, but it needs to be improved. It needs to, and the kind of principle here is to always improve the resolution at which we can sift and filter what goes through fences. I think I'll stop here. All right. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, и у нас есть немного времени для вопросов.
Thank you. No, I'm speaking English. That's fine.
Okay.
So I basically have two issues that I think are interesting in relation to basically everything you talked about.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I think as far as gated communities today, I mean, the way to go is to think about favelas, like like a slum, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm from Argentina, and basically the way favela works in my country, at least, I think in Brazil it's kind of the same issue. Is that somebody will look at the favela as like a marginalization, like somebody that is not included into the city or into the economic system or through the tax impositive system. But the way it works is that politicians normally move let's say, people from rural areas into urban areas, and by way of necessity, these people need to relocate in an impoverished place with low resources. But the way it works is they get their political consensus from these people by maintaining them in this kind of like parasitical environment. I mean, what I'm saying is that it kind of resembles to what you were saying, in the sense that it looks purely aesthetical and economical, but it's working, it's allowing a type of totalitarian government that someone can build consensus over these people because they have no opportunities and whatever, but they force them to vote for them, just threatening that, well, we brought you here, and if we're not here, you're not gonna have anything. So I think that's a good example, or similar to what you were saying. I mean, this landscape is working as a kind of power institution. It's a consensus of power. And the second one, which is more, second point, is related to, in a way, Trump and what you were talking about Trump, because the construction of a border, as far as I understand, a strong border allows you to control the people that are inside the community. Not only like you say, well, that's outside, this is inside, the people from outside don't come. And I mean, making again a reference to my country, I remember basically the most important book in the 19th century was a book called Facundo, which was wrote by a guy called Sarmiento, and he talks about how the gaucho, the Argentine gaucho, is extremely antisocial because he cannot be controlled, because there is no border in the country. I mean, you have the sea, and then you have the Andes, so there's like no natural border to kind of politically reunite these people, no? So what happens is that, what he says is that the landscape, in a way, shapes the political style of the country, which is, you're not going to be able to construct a modern state because you cannot reunite the people. Basically what's going to happen is that the most powerful one of the gauchos, or the best horse rider, whatever, the most violent one, will be the leader. So it's in a way the landscape, again, it's working as a power. It's like it's fashioning the way the politics of the place are going to work. So it's just like thinking in the sense like, well, Trump, maybe, the wall is, in a way, the border is enclosing the states, the United States, for a better domination of the states. Not only to say, well, the Mexicans, so it's like this kind of ghettoization, no, of the country. So it's just like these 2 points, I think, were resonating closely to what you were saying,
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you...
Should we respond now, or take all the questions, or just to respond with a question, to kind of further elaborate and make sure we also understand each other. About the favela example, do you know of examples of favelas that are actually materially circled by a fence?
By a border?
Yeah. No, because, and perhaps it also relates to the other part of your comment. I just want to be very explicit about this. I speak of these fences and technologies of enclosure in a very material sense. I'm not talking about, again, like symbolic or metaphoric fences or limits. If I speak of fences, because there is an actual kind of material limitation, and I think it's important because often, there is a kind of approach to fences which I was trying, perhaps not super clearly, to kind of also criticize. It is borders, fences, etc., to see it as, this is only symbolic now. It's a spectacle of the border. In fact, the states are no longer sovereign, and they do this in order to reassert their sovereignty by other means, right? I disagree with that reading. I think, especially when you look at, let's say, an extreme case such as Gaza, or in generally occupied Palestinian territories, the walls are very material, very kind of performative, operational devices. They do something, right? They channel flows in one place where it can be controlled materially, physically, etc. And in that sense, I would be interested in reading or exploring cases of favelas as actual spaces of containment, which would perhaps, I don't know of any other example than Gaza, in which you have this logic of, the outcast will actually sort of encircle them physically so as not to allow them to exit, while most often in terms of the logic of current urbanism, you've got the other way around, right? People erecting borders around themselves in order to protect them from the perceived outside. But I wondered if this reversibility question that we've also evoked would apply to the question of limits of ghettos or ghettoization, which are actually physically marked now, beyond the kind of principle, beyond also the kind of still very material aspect of, let's say, the lack of infrastructure, of communication, of transport, etc. Most of these places are isolated, even though they have no kind of material clear fence that marks the limit of what it is, but simply they become difficult to access. They kind of, So I don't know how much it answers, but I would like to just highlight that the kind of principle or underlying approach or perspective on this question that I have is a very materialist one anchored on the kind of on the physical operation of these architectural devices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, I'm not sure the exact wording, but you mentioned you were talking about fences or borders as enablers of differential boundaries, just like in a very, very physical sense, like a fence being a design tool to enable flow in a given direction, in a physical sense. And do you have any thoughts or any analogies in terms of like more digitally, like beyond physical borders? What about digital borders or digital enclaves that control the flow of information? Like that's a type of border which is not symbolic, it's actually as actual as the physical one. So just did you expand your thinking in that direction and how?
Not yet, but we can. I mean, like one of the analogy that I generally use personally to kind of think this notion of territorial differentials would be that of electricity, right? I mean, electrical current is made possible by a difference of potential, right? A difference of potential between two states. So only because you've got this difference, you've got a current flowing. Otherwise, you cannot have a current flowing, right? So in this sense, the kind of, I think you can read the what some urban geographers have called theory of uneven development in geography in those same principles, right? Establishing borders as devices or resistance, if you want, that would kind of establish differences of potential that creates the need or the kind of drive for a flow across them. Now, to kind of transpose it into the circulation of data or bits, etc., I don't know, I'm not able to do it on the fly, but perhaps I don't know if we can do it together or something, or if there is any, if there is such thing. I mean, the kind of, it's true that I guess the circulation of data is thought essentially as unhindered, no? Like it just depends, it's like the configuration, where it goes, where it is stocked, etc. is important, but how it goes through obstacles is less kind of thought of. And I wondered if there are these obstacles, or perhaps the equivalent of the obstacle in this kind of digital domain would be simply what it bypasses, right? Where the kind of also material infrastructure, the cables that are enabling the circulation of certain data pass and don't pass. I wonder if it's around that.
Well, also just to be clear, I don't mean obstacles in a kind of a negative sense, like I mean a very productive design tool,
exactly,
enabler of, because the analogy that you made of the number of calories entering Gaza was actually incredibly interesting to me.
Yeah.
This idea of the quantification of this physical, so analogies in the digital space would be interesting, but yes, maybe we can work those together. Thank you.